we are very honored to have him here with us today. So please welcome Dr. Stanley Krippner.
Well, thank you very much for your gracious introduction. And it's wonderful to be back at the Foundation for Mind Being Research. I am so happy to see such a wonderful turnout. And again, it's always a pleasure to speak in a Unity church. I've spoken in many churches throughout the ages, but I think that I've probably given more talks in Unity churches than anything else. And I personally am of the Unitarian Universalist equation, so I've spoken in many of those churches, and there's not too much difference between both congregations because they're on the cutting edge of spirituality. They believe in individual thought, they believe in freedom of expression, and that brings us to our topic tonight on ayahuasca. Now, my relationship with ayahuasca, believe it or not, goes back almost 70 years. Because in the 1950s, I was a student at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and my anthropology professor, William McGovern, was sort of a Raiders of the Lost Ark character at that time, examining cultures in various parts of the world. He was the very first white person to visit Tibet, and he stained his face brown. He put acid in his red eyes, in his blue eyes to make them red, and he got away with it, except at the end he was almost killed. He had to leave in a rush because it was so forbidden for outsiders to visit the theocracy at that time. Well, he wrote a book about that called To Lhasa in Disguise. But he wrote another book called Jungle Paths and Inca Ruins. And he, knowing of my interest in parapsychology, was telling me how when he was in the Amazon basin, he was in a ceremony with the local shaman imbibing yahe, which of course is one of the names for ayahuasca, one of several names. And the shaman was able to have an out-of-body experience and go to a tribe some 200 miles away and describe a funeral service that was going on for a chief who had died unexpectedly, describing it in great detail while McGovern took copious notes. Some weeks later, McGovern was at that village and found out that indeed there had been a funeral, and every detail that the shaman had related was absolutely correct. So, of course, I was very much interested in yahe and sort of followed the developments as best I could. There wasn't too much written about it at the time. And then, some 15 years later, there was a parapsychology conference in New York City. And on the panel was J.B. Ryan, who those of you who know about parapsychology know is the founder of experimental parapsychology in the United States. And in the audience was Allen Ginsberg, the famous beat poet. And of course, he is the co-author with William Burroughs of the Yahe Papers, telling about their experiences with Yahe in South America. Well, Allen Ginsberg was quite irrepressible, and he came running up afterwards and said, Dr. Ryan, you have to take Yahe. You know that another name for it is telepathine, because you can read the minds of people hundreds of miles away, like William Burroughs and I did. And of course, Ryan listened to him very patiently, was in no position, of course, to go to South America. So then Allen Ginsberg talked with me, and I got even more information about Yahe from him personally, never suspecting that some decades later I would be in Brazil and would be invited to participate in an ayahuasca ceremony, and let's just say that the rest is history. Now, I could tell you many interesting stories about my experiences with ayahuasca in Brazil over the years, but let me just tell you one that is extremely anomalous and shows you, I think, the reaches of ayahuasca. As you'll find out later in the lecture, if you don't already know about it, there are actually 3 legitimate churches in Brazil, Burquinha, Santo Daime, and União de Vegetal, that use ayahuasca as a sacrament. And I was invited to a ceremony in southern Brazil, and it was off in the rainforest because many of the churches are in the natural settings. And as we were on our way to the UDV, the União de Vegetal Church, in a very rugged station wagon that could travel over the rough surfaces, my traveling companion, Christopher Ryan, said, "Stan, did you see that beautiful woman we just passed?" And I said, no, where is she? "Oh, we've gone past her. I hope she shows up at the service tonight. She's wearing a green sari, but she's Brazilian. You can tell it because of the dark skin. But she has a cast mark in the middle of her head, and she is wearing red-headed hair. Obviously, her hair has been dyed." Well, I thought that's a good description. I'll look for her. So we get to the church, and we enter through the kitchen. And there in the kitchen, preparing the repast, which will be held after the services, is a beautiful Brazilian woman with red-headed hair, a cast mark, and wearing a green sari. And Chris said, "How did you get her so quickly? We passed you on the road." And she said, "No, I've been here all afternoon." This is even before we took ayahuasca. So, once you enter the world of ayahuasca, anything can happen, and it's very unpredictable. So, this is both a promise and a peril. This is why I do not encourage people to take ayahuasca, because you never know what you're going to get into. And I have seen many examples of that, and you will hear some examples of that during my talk tonight. Now, I know that many of you folks have taken ayahuasca, many of you know about ayahuasca, so this is not exactly a talk for beginners. You're going to get a lot of detail, a lot of in-depth detail, a lot of scientific and psychological experiments, and I hope that we will have time for questions, and so if you do miss anything that's basic, I can answer them at that time. So, ayahuasca is a Quechua word that is usually translated as the vine with a soul. Other languages use such terms as yahe or dame, half a dozen others, depending on the part of the rainforest that the tea is imbibed in. The brew can be found throughout the Amazon basins of Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. My experience has been in Brazil, but I've had other friends who have participated in each of those other countries. The botany of ayahuasca is complicated. It involves combinations of 3 groups of plants. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the MAOs, dimethyltryptamine, DMT carriers, and various additives. The Banisteriopsis vine is a MAO inhibitor. Psychotria viridis, or in some parts of the Amazon, a different plant carries DMT. Now, the additives vary from locale to locale and are used to potentiate the mind-altering effects of the mixture, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the additives later. The important thing to realize is that the mixture will vary from one part of the rainforest to another part of the rainforest, depending on simply what is available. And also, each shaman has his or her own special recipe. Now, we have to understand what the MAO inhibitors are. MAOI stands for a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. In order to understand what a MAOI is, we must first understand what monoamine oxidase is. MAO is an enzyme which oxidizes, thereby breaking down certain compounds to prevent them from reaching organs such as the brain. So the MAOI is a compound that inhibits the activity of MAO enzymes. A MAOI allows the amines that the MAO would normally have broken down to remain active in the body for longer. Go Okay, so that's one part of the equation. Now why is this important? Mauis can be used to increase and modify the effects of many psychedelics, especially those containing indole and tryptamine alkaloids. A Maui is an essential component of making tryptamine alkaloids such as DMT orally active and is therefore necessary for the preparation of ayahuasca. Now, you can take the plants with DMT without the Maui, but they simply are not as potent as if you take them with the Maui. It's important to be extremely cautious of working with Mauis, as they can be toxic when combined with other substances. And folks, this is something that I can't stress too strongly. I am on a listserv of ayahuasca investigators, and a couple of times a year we get the news that somebody has died while taking ayahuasca. And, of course, sometimes they enter into it in poor health and they probably would have died anyway. In other cases, they're just taking the wrong type of the mixture, and it has not been prepared carefully. So, you know, this is a risk that people have to consider, and the decision to make when people are considering taking ayahuasca is this risk worth it? And so this is why we have to be cautious. Dimethyltryptamine, DMT, is also known as N,N-dimethyltryptamine, is a naturally occurring tryptamine and potent psychedelic drug found not only in many plants but also in trace amounts in the human body, where its natural function is undetermined. Yes, the body produces its own DMT, and there are meditative practices that actually stimulate the production of DMT. And so, as I've said for decades, any place that you can go with psychedelics, you can go without psychedelics if you have the right set, the right setting, the right body chemicals, and the right frame of mind. So no, you don't have to take ayahuasca to have the benefits. It might take a little longer, but your own body can produce many of the same chemicals if you know how to access them. DMT is created in small amounts by the human body during normal metabolism by the enzyme tryptamine M-methyltransferase. Now, DMT was first synthesized by British chemist Robert Manske in the 1930s, but its psychotropic properties weren't discovered until 1956, when the Hungarian chemist and psychiatrist Stephen Zara extracted DMT from the plant Mimosa hostilis, Jurema, and injected the substance into his own body. Zara proceeded to experience intense hallucinations that were much more intense than those of other hallucinogens, as well as shorter lasting. This psychedelic discovery triggered a wave of both scientific research and popular intrigue about DMT. Now, those of you who know anything about the discovery of LSD, this is familiar. Remember that it was Albert Hofmann who accidentally ingested LSD, and on one occasion he took his famous bicycle ride and had a psychedelic experience. It's the one he didn't fall off his bike, riding from his laboratory to his home. Well, that story is very well known. Zara's story is not so well known, but it's again a risk that he took injecting the substance into his own body. Now, that name Jurema is the name of the plant that is used in the Amazon. And a little later we're going to be talking about the Icaros, the hymns that are sung by the psychedelic churches that use ayahuasca. And there is one hymn, there is one Icaro that sings in honor of Jurema. So Jurema is not in Spanish Jurema, in Portuguese Jurema, is memorialized in one of the standard Icaros or hymns. Ingenious shamans distinguish over 40 varieties of ayahuasca vines. They cultivate the vines by using cuttings. The young shoot is put in water, and after it forms roots, it's put in soil and watered frequently. These vines belong to the Banisterius caapi family. The stems are very long with many branches and green oval leaves. They rarely produce flowers, but when they do, the flowers are white or pale pink. And again, in Brazil, I have seen them do the preparation. They sing the traditional songs while they're preparing the vines, and they are beating the vines to extract the chemicals. They're putting them in hot water. It's a whole day process to do the preparation, and doing the preparation is really part of the ceremony. So it's not only what happens during the church service itself, but it's preceded by a great deal of preparation. And then after the church service, there is discussion. People will share their experiences. And so this is a very prolonged service if you're in for the long haul. Psychotria viridis is also known to have several varieties. Like Monoceros caapi, it grows wild, but can be cultivated. It is a strong green bush that has greenish-white petals attached to long stalks. Cultivation by means of seeds is less fruitful than using cuttings. There are other plants in the Amazon basin that are MAO inhibitors that contain DMT. Shamans often search for these plants so that they have a ready supply in case the traditional plants are not available. In addition, shamans sometimes employ additives, most notably coca leaves, tobacco, peyote, and San Pedro cactus, and the latter two contain mescaline. So when we talk about additives, yes, these are some of the additives, and the additives will vary from one part of the Amazon basin to the other. So no two preparations of ayahuasca or yahe or hoasca are exactly the same. The shamans have their own special recipes, communities have their own special recipes, and the important thing, however, is that you've got to have the plants that contain the DMT, and then you've got to have the MAO inhibitors that keep the serotonin down so that the psychedelic effect can trigger the brain. Oh, good heavens. Nightmare. Now, we have to get back on track here, and can somebody help me? This is always my fear that we have a breakdown of the audio-visual, but we have some experts here, I think, who will get us back on track. Okay, those of you who came in late, are going to get a recap of what I've already talked about. The botany of ayahuasca, see here you have the various additives, that's just what I finished talking about. Here's an explanation for the MAO inhibitors and why they are important. And here we have the description of DMT and its synthesis, and why no two are exactly the same. And now, here is a very, very important study. You won't find this in the standard chemistry books, but Jeremy Narby, a close friend of mine and a noted anthropologist, he has one of the best jobs in the world. He has a private foundation who subsidizes him. He lives in Switzerland. He can investigate any anthropological area that he wants. His foundation will give him carte blanche. And so he has written some of the classic books. His book on the cosmic serpent is how he thinks the shamans visualized the double helix way before Crick and Watson came up with it. His book, 500 Years of Shamanism, is an overview of shamanism and how Westerners reacted to it. His little-known book, Intelligence in Nature, is a minor classic, showing how nature is much more intelligent than we give it credit for, and that intelligence didn't start with humans. It goes back over the millennia. So, Jeremy Narby in 1999 did a little experiment. He took 3 molecular biologists to the Peruvian Amazon to see if they could engage in creative problem solving during an ayahuasca session conducted by an indigenous shaman. Each scientist brought an unsolved problem, one that had eluded comprehension over time. They spent 2 weeks with the shaman, and they visited a school for bilingual multicultural education where students from 14 different linguistic backgrounds were learning how to teach science in the Spanish language. There are some incredible schools in the Peruvian Amazon and the Brazilian Amazon, by the way, especially the schools for artists that I'm familiar with. The three scientists spoke positively about their Amazonia experiences, but also warned against the unsupervised use of ayahuasca and other psychoactive substances because they were aware of the possible risks. All three of the biologists agreed that their experiences with ayahuasca had changed their worldview, especially with regard to the information they received about the scientific problem on which each had focused. The two female biologists reported contact with plant teachers, and the male biologist received answers from the voice that spoke to him in his visions. All three had visions about DNA molecules and chromosomes relative to their work. Now, this is very typical, and many of you who have taken ayahuasca know what I'm talking about. Ayahuasca, among other things, is a teacher. And sometimes the teacher speaks with a voice. Sometimes the teacher is embodied, and you have a teacher in the form of a serpent, in the form of a wise old woman, a wise old man, some animal teacher, some metaphysical teacher. But this is why ayahuasca is known as a teaching brew. Because yes, you do get lessons. Sometimes you get lessons you don't want to hear, but they're very insistent. In 2012, Susana Bustos studied the role of the Icaros, or healing songs, that I mentioned earlier, in ayahuasca sessions. During an 8-month field study in Peru, she collected data from 5 adult men and women who reported extensive experiences with ayahuasca. After listening to a sound-recorded ceremony, her participants identified the Icaros as were most significant to them. Bustos used a descriptive phenomenology method to study the reports. Now, you'd be surprised at how much research is going on with ayahuasca. Just within the last 10 years, I'm a member of the ayahuasca researcher listserv, and just about every month there's an article that's published, a Ph.D. dissertation, a master's thesis, a journal article. Most of these are not done by Americans. They're done by people from Latin America, by and large, where the atmosphere is much more conducive. At Saybrook University, we actually have had several dissertations dealing with ayahuasca, or the ayahuasca churches, and one of them, by a Brazilian student, actually was about Barquinha, one of the ayahuasca churches. He was able to turn this into a book, the only book published so far on this particular religion in which ayahuasca is a sacrament. Anyway, Bustos found 28 meaning constituents that fell into 3 categories: lyrics, singing voice, and the dynamics of the music itself. Her participants reported that the Icaro was linked to pivotal moments in the healing process, and that there was a gradual development during an ayahuasca ceremony. Its expression is dependent upon the ceremony's context and integrated process. Yes, music is extremely important in these church services, and I have had ayahuasca 10 times, and each time there has been music. And the music varies. It's very different in Santo Daime than it is from União de Vegetal, but there is music, either live music or recorded music, that plays a very important role. And the Icaros, which you mainly find in Santo Daime and in Barquinha, have references to the plants, as I mentioned before. They have references to folklore, and of course, very interesting development is that Umbanda, one of the African Brazilian religions, in some parts of Brazil now is merging with Santo Daime, and so the Icaros actually make reference to some of the gods and goddesses from the Umbanda religion, like Iemanjá, the goddess of the waters, or Shango, the god of thunder. And so there's this interesting cross-pollination that you find out. Just as an aside, some of you have heard of the World Parliament of Religions, and last year the World Parliament held its convention in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I submitted a presentation on the African religions of Brazil, and it was very, very well attended. I had a marvelous sideshow. I devoted the last 10 minutes of my talk to the ayahuasca churches, and people were asking for copies of my PowerPoint, and then I realized that I was the only representative of South America in that entire meeting that brought in 6,000 people, dozens of different religions. And so here I was, a white guy from the United States representing all of South America. Well, I didn't mind because I'm actually an honorary member of Candomblé. I'm an honorary member of Umbanda. I've been in many of those services. I have been in many of the, not many, I've been in 10 church services with ayahuasca, so I did the best I could. I really felt that this tradition should be represented. Now, as I was saying a moment ago, there are 3 major religions in Brazil that use ayahuasca as a sacrament. União de Vegetal, Vegetable Union, Santo Daime, Give Me Health, and Barquinha, Little Boat. The cognitive science Benny Shannon has published a book and several articles reviewing his fieldwork in Brazil with these churches, describing the psychological insights, philosophical ideas, and spiritual experiences that he and others have reported. Benny Shannon is from Israel, and he has spent a great deal of time with the churches, and as a cognitive scientist, he has come up with some insights that nobody else has reported, published articles, published a whole book on them. Shannon's classifications included factual knowledge, such as memories of past experience, psychological knowledge, such as personal and interpersonal insights, specialized knowledge, such as diagnosis and treatment of ailments, artistic performance and creativity, such as original narratives, knowledge about consciousness, such as non-ordinary phenomenology, knowledge related to nature, such as empathy with other animals and species, philosophical reflections, such as attribution of meaning to natural phenomena, and wisdom, such as acknowledging the dance of life. Shannon has concluded that the ayahuasca visions are not to be interpreted as codes, but as depictions, like works of art. They need not be deciphered, but are to be appreciated in terms of their impact on the participants. This is extremely important, because if he had come from a psychoanalytic background, he would have interpreted the visions with a psychoanalytic bias, of course, looking for the deeper meaning of the symbols. But he said, no, you take these at face value, because what they have to teach at face value is really all you need to know. If the ayahuasca teachers wanted there to be deeper meaning, they would have told this to you. So what you take is what you get, and what you get is what was given. A very, very common sense approach to how you deal with the ayahuasca visions and experiences. A 1996 study by Grobe and his associates was published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. I mention this because some very, very respectable journals have been publishing about ayahuasca. They compared 15 União de Vegetal members with 15 matched controls, finding a strong and positive impact in the lives of UDV members. No, these were not people that fell apart or became addicts after taking ayahuasca. They did not become unemployed. They did not become criminals. No, they lived very exemplary lives. A similar study by Fabregas and his associates was published in the Journal of Drug and Alcohol Dependence in 2010. This study surveyed members of Santo Daime and yielded similar results. So we have some data, long-term users of both UDV and Santo Daime ayahuasca turn out pretty well after all is said and done at the end of the day. A 2005 study by Doreen Silveira and her associates found that UDV membership was associated with reduced drug abuse among teenagers. No studies have been published contradicting these reports. Barbosa and Associates published a 2014 survey in the journal Alcoholism of some 1,700 members of the União de Vegetal Church, reporting lower rates of addiction relative to the general population. Now, it's important that no studies have been published contradicting these reports, because if you're familiar with the marijuana literature over the years, the marijuana is still scheduled as a type 5 substance with no medicinal value and high risk for abuse, despite the tons of medical marijuana reports have been published. The government just refuses to budge on terms of reclassifying marijuana. In fact, a lot of federal money has gone to finding the negative effects of marijuana. If you want money, Samuel, to do a study on the negative effects of marijuana, you'll get tons of money. Why? Because Big Pharma is against medical marijuana. The entrenched bureaucracy is against medical marijuana. And I could go off on a rant on that particular topic, but I think that the point is made. Where are the studies showing the negative effects of ayahuasca? Whenever there is a death, this is front page news. All the opponents of ayahuasca use make a big deal out of this, especially in Brazil. Where does the opposition come from in Brazil? From the fundamentalistic churches, especially the evangelical churches. They say that ayahuasca is the work of the devil, and they constantly are trying to put bills through the Brazilian Congress to outlaw ayahuasca, even though long ago the Brazilian parliament legalized the 3 churches, legalized ayahuasca if it was conducted in a religious setting. And that law is constantly under assault by the evangelicals. So far they have held firm. I should mention the recent scandals in Brazil by the 4 U.S. swimmers. Yes, very bad. The Americans behaved badly. The police exaggerated the reports. But what nobody noticed was that all 4 of the swimmers were under the influence of alcohol. If they had been under the influence of marijuana, this would have been at the top of the article. Marijuana-crazed swimmers commit vandalism. No, that wasn't even mentioned. They were drunk on alcohol. What can you expect? So that was one of the ironies of that particular scandal. In 2015, a landmark book was published. I cannot emphasize the importance of this book. Unfortunately, it costs an arm and a leg, but it's a big, thick book. The Therapeutic Uses of Ayahuasca, edited by Beatrice Labate and Clancy Caviar. It presents several perspectives on the therapeutic potentials of both the ritual and the clinical use of ayahuasca in the treatment and management of various diseases and ailments, especially substance dependence, post-traumatic stress disorder, and psychological depression. The settings range from indigenous contexts, neo-shamanic rituals, religious circles, and clinical therapeutic settings in North and South America and Europe. The reports are primarily anecdotal because there has been no systematic study thus far. Several chapters in the book address the methodological, ethical, and political aspects of research. Fully half the book chapters contain substance abuse and addiction. This is one of the applications of ayahuasca that you read about, and I am going to take some stuff from the literature a little bit later and show why ayahuasca seems to be so effective in fighting addiction and how it really does have therapeutic potential. In 2016, Coopers and his associates found that ayahuasca reduced the processing of judgments and internal cognitive activity. These are both goals of mindfulness meditation and mindfulness psychotherapy. They also found that ayahuasca increased creative divergent thinking, another goal of some types of psychotherapy, because it allows the production of new coping strategies. And this is an important article, and I actually brought that article, and I'm leaving it here. Should any of you want copies of it, you can simply request it, because, yes. Yes, Sue, thank you. You have a copy of it, and people can also get copies of the PowerPoint if you want. anything that you want to take with you from this lecture is easy to do, okay? So here we have a clue. The ayahuasca dynamics reduce thinking, reduce the process of judgment making, reduce internal cognitive activity. They have almost a meditative effect, very close to the mindfulness psychotherapies. And they also have a creative effect. No wonder there's been so much wonderful art coming out of ayahuasca sessions. And I would recommend the book Ayahuasca Visions by Amaringo and Luna, which is now out in paperback, which shows some of the, if you can't take ayahuasca, take a look at that book, and you'll get a very typical folio of what the ayahuasca visions are all about. Cooper's study involved 26 participants in 2 spiritual communities where ayahuasca was used as a sacrament. The participants were from North and South America and the Middle East. All reported having had previous experiences with ayahuasca. Creativity tests were administered both before and after ayahuasca ingestion and in a spiritual setting. There were no significant regional or gender differences, but the effects were stronger among the older participants and for those who had taken ayahuasca several times. In 2016, the journal Psychopharmacology published Cooper's research about ayahuasca, and the article commented, increasing evidence from anecdotal reports and informal studies indicates that ayahuasca may have therapeutic effects in the treatment of depression and substance abuse. So we have a lot of anecdotal reports, and the book by Bia and Clancy, both friends of mine, pulls a lot of those anecdotes together, and eventually there will be more systematic studies, but this is a clue in terms of where they seem to have the most potent effect: depression and substance abuse. Occasionally you find out somebody has recovered from cancer, some other life-threatening disease, by taking ayahuasca. Is this placebo effect, or is there something that, shall we say, stimulates the inner shaman, the inner healer? This is a topic to find out in the future. I don't care if people get well, that's the bottom line for me. In a 2016 article in the International Review of Neurology, Toffoli and Diajunup speculated on why ayahuasca and other psychedelics have had apparent success in treating substance abuse and addiction. The effects of ayahuasca began about 30 minutes after oral ingestion and last about 4 hours. Autonomic responses include increases in cardiac and respiratory rates, blood pressure, temperature, and pupil diameter. Psychological effects include enhanced visual imagery, especially with the eyes closed, increased introspection, changes in mood, and the recall of highly emotional memories. Now, those of you who have taken ayahuasca, all of this will ring true. Even though each person's experience is different, these are the typical experiences, both physiological and psychological, that you might have. On the neurological level, ayahuasca increases activity of the visual cortex. Well, that's why you have the visions, the parafrontal gyrus, and the default mode network, the DMN. This is very important. The DMN is a set of brain regions with higher activity at rest relative to externally oriented tasks. It has been associated with mind wandering and rumination. DMN activity is disrupted both by psychedelics and by mindfulness meditation, perhaps allowing the client to produce insights, to introspect, and become more self-aware. This ties in with what we found out in the other study, that ayahuasca helps to produce a mindfulness effect. Less mind wandering, less rumination, more introspection, more insights. In 1998, Donald Topping wrote an article for the MAPS newsletter, Ayahuasca and Cancer. I hope you all know what MAPS is, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has been one of the leaders in terms of urging for and even funding research with ayahuasca and other psychedelics. This is reviewed by Eduardo Schoenberg in the 2013 issue of Open Medicine. Topping had been told by his physicians that he had 2 more months to live. As a last resort, he went to the Amazon and underwent an ayahuasca healing regimen for his terminal colon cancer, as well as associated cancer of his liver. Serious, serious stuff, folks. He's alive today. Topping's survival inspired Schoenberg to travel to Peru for treatment of his prostate cancer. His report describes the healing ceremony in great detail, but he notes that playing with ayahuasca is like playing with fire. I agree. Nonetheless, his test results steadily improved from November 2013 to March 2015. Eventually, he was allowed to bring native plant powders back to Germany with him, where he continued to take the preparations. In 2015, he returned to Peru, where 2 shamans told him that he was cured. Upon returning to Germany, his test results continued to improve. The major test for prostate cancer yielded readings that were the lowest of his life. Now, I'm going to end by telling you about a very, very important project called the Aftercare Project. Have any of you heard of this? Aha, something new for you, old veterans. Yes, this is something brand new. Dedicated to the psychological and spiritual well-being of people who are consolidating what they have learned after intense experiences of ayahuasca and other psychedelic substances. The project is especially geared to people who require special assistance with integrating their profound experiences and require the help of an experienced and understanding therapist. The cadre of therapists in this project have expertise in helping their clients work through the lessons attained and integrating them into their lives. And again, the project is a not-for-profit group sponsored by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. You can get information through MAPS or their own website that you can access on the internet. And most of the therapists who are members of this project are volunteers. They put in X number of hours a week or a month to actually work with people who need help in integrating their experiences into their everyday life. And this is extremely important because I've known of people who go through a psychedelic session, get illumination, get insights, and then return to their same old neurotic lifestyle. Well, the Aftercare Project tries to help them consolidate what they've learned into their life. So it's like a massive follow-up experience, all in favor of such projects, of course. So, of course, the big question is, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, how did the shamans in the Amazon basin know out of all of the hundreds of thousands of plants in the Amazon, which ones contained DMT and which ones permitted the expression of DMT? How did they know this? Baffling. You ask the shamans, no mystery to them. I've asked the shaman, well, the plants told us this. And I guess that's the best answer that I could give. Thank you. Okay, I promised some time for questions. Now I'm hard of hearing, so you folks are going to have to speak up. Yes.
I would like to ask whether people take this as a drink.
Somebody's going to have to listen and translate.
Do people take this as a drink, like a tea?
Or smoke it.
Pardon me?
Smoke it.
Do people take this as a drink, like a tea, or do they smoke it?
It's more effective if it's taken as a tea. An excellent question. Yes, it can be smoked, it can be eaten, but in this case it's more effective if it is imbibed. Yes, Pratibha is one of our distinguished Saybrook graduates, and if you want to learn about pranayama, you go to her. She is one of the experts on that wonderful discipline. Russ.
Stan, thank you very much for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My ESP tells me that in this group there are a number of people who would like to know how to get in touch with someone who can introduce them to ayahuasca, either through Santa Dama or somebody else.
Yes.
And you could either tell the group or you could do it privately.
Yes, You know, I anticipate this question every time I talk on the topic. And to be very frank with you, I have not attempted to have interactions with people in the area who run the sessions. Otherwise, I would be a conduit. And I've got enough things to do, I've got enough problems in my life. I can only give them generalized advice and say, make sure you go with somebody who has had training, who has studied with shamans, who is a member of a church, or, you know, there are actually underground physicians who use ayahuasca with their clients. And there's a whole network of people in the Bay Area, and you have to do some digging, and you have to remember the guidelines that I just told you. Find somebody who's recommended, find somebody or a group with a track record. There's an ayahuasca group in the Santa Cruz area. There's one in Marin County. I just have not. One of my students is doing the research. She is in contact with such a group, but I haven't even asked her what group she's in contact with, and it'll be anonymous in her dissertation. So, if you really want it bad enough, you have to do your own homework, okay? Yes?
Would you say, I've heard people with having negative experiences, I've heard of people having the learning experiences. Would you say intention? I mean, if you were to use it, some people use it just to get high versus someone who actually wants to go and have a spiritual opening experience or awakening. Do you think that might have an effect on the experience?
I suspect it does. I would say that, as is the case with any psychedelic, there's a group of people who, for better or for worse, hopefully for better, simply want to have a new experience, or who want to do something so that they can talk about it with their friends. Those people are probably well-intended, but the people who are out for more serious experiences and more spiritual experiences are probably the ones who get more out of the experience than not. I can't say that this always happens, because I know some people who have been very frivolous and who have gone to ayahuasca without any serious intention, and they have had a powerful experience that has changed their life. So you just never know, and the research hasn't been done. But you use the word intention. Yes, I think intention is the key to many of our experiences. It's the key to many of our healing experiences. It's the key to many of our spiritual experiences. You put your intention in the right place. As Russ knows, intention is very important for remote viewing experiences, other types of parapsychological experiences. And we don't give enough focus to intention in our daily life, and we really need to do this. People need to be trained to have a mindset and project something into the universe that will yield what they really need to know. Good question. Okay, yes.
Well, you have certainly put some time and effort in researching this. What is it that you would like to see happen with this substance? Do you have a sense of, as society progresses, that it's more accepted? What is your concept of, why are you researching it so much?
Well, what I would like to see happen is the same thing I wanted to see happen when I had my first LSD experience back in the early 1960s. I'd like to see it researched to the point where it could be put to practical and beneficial use. It's taken, how long, 40, 50 years for that to happen, but better late than never. And I think that ayahuasca is off to a little better start, because we don't have a crackdown on ayahuasca. One of the great surprises, of course, is that when the UDV Church appealed to the Supreme Court to overturn a local court's ban on ayahuasca under the Freedom of Religion Act, the entire Supreme Court unanimously voted to favor ayahuasca use in a spiritual setting. Even the most conservative justices voted for this.
Surprising.
And so now ayahuasca is off to a much better start than LSD was, and it won't be long before we can maybe pinpoint the best way that this could have a therapeutic use. And again, my vision would be to find spiritual centers where it could have a spiritual use, maybe under the rubric of one of the Brazilian churches, or maybe some church with more indigenous roots.
I'm going to help translate.
All right.
Okay.
First, why did you take ayahuasca 10 times?
Why did you take ayahuasca 10 times?
Different question. Because I was invited. Yes, I was in Brazil, and a representative of the church says, "We are so happy that you're here. Would you like to join us for a session?" And of course I said yes. So I've never sought it out. Each time it was an invitation. And my own experiences have been very, very illuminating, I'm happy to say, yes.
Could you
And I've written about some of them, yes.
So why did you find them illuminating?
You know, it would be really helpful if you could stand up and he could see your face.
Everybody, when you ask a question,
Yeah.
please stand up.
That's why the microphone's in my hand. So
Okay.
Stanley, why did you find the experience illuminating?
Why did you find the experience illuminating?
Because ayahuasca is very much of a teacher, and I get very, very helpful lessons. One lesson that I got was for the ayahuasca spirit to tell me, "You think too much about the past and all the mistakes you've made in the past. You've got to just let those experiences go, let those mistakes go, learn from them, get on with your life. And then you worry too much about the future and about all of the problems that you're going to have in the future. You've just got to let the future take care of itself. You've got to live more in the here and the now." Well, of course, that makes perfect sense, but to hear it from an ayahuasca spirit, I took it more seriously. And so that became a much more vital part of my life. I could go on and on and on. I had a very beautiful experience in Brazil in a União de Vegetal meeting. This time I used intention. And I said, okay, my intention is to enter the mind of God. I was not going, no modest request. So, under ayahuasca, I found myself in the mind of God. It was a beautiful temple, a column. I was in the inside, and it was decorated with tiles and beautiful green and purple tiles. And some of the tiles had inscriptions on them in 3 different languages, none of which I could read. But the spirit of ayahuasca told me the green tiles contain information that humans already know. The blue tiles are information that humans will discover. The purple tiles, information human beings will never know. They don't have enough nerve cells to know that. So that has kept me very modest. Yes, there are some things in the universe which are simply going to be beyond our comprehension, at least in the present form of our evolution. I could go on and on, but those are some of the things I have learned during the ayahuasca sessions. I had a wonderful experience with the Divine Feminine. And this was in Manaus during a notorious ayahuasca session. And I can tell you why it was notorious later on. But I was transported to this camp that had pavilions. And each pavilion was run by a different goddess I went into one pavilion, and there was Urzule, the voodoo goddess of beauty and love, and I had sex with Urzule. And then another one's Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of beauty, and I had sex with Aphrodite. And then the other one was Oshun, the Candomblé goddess of beauty, and I had sex with her. So I've never had so much sex with such beautiful women in my life, not on the earthly plane. And then, before I should go on to the next pavilion, the person next to me said, I've got to vomit. Can you help me go off and vomit? So I had to leave the goddesses behind and take him off into the clearing so he could throw up, sort of nurse him back and then bring him back to the circle. And so, you know, this was illuminating to me because it said, you have to enjoy the pleasures while you can, because you never know when somebody's going to vomit all day.
Another question. Are there any ongoing studies on the consistent health benefits of ayahuasca, or were these isolated incidents?
Are there any ongoing studies on the consistent health of ayahuasca?
Health benefits.
Health benefits of ayahuasca?
No, I wish there were. The only two studies I've already summarized for you. Charles Grubb, some of you know of, he runs a treatment center for dying people in Southern California associated with his university. And he's went to Brazil and studied long-term users in UDV and found that they were healthier than non-users. And then his associate did the same thing for Santo Daime with the same results. Those two studies have never been attacked. I think they stand up very well. And so you might say that they were healthier to begin with, we don't know. And they might have been healthier to begin with, and this is what drew them to that experience. But at least the ayahuasca didn't do them any harm. Yeah, those two studies are in the PowerPoint. I wish there had been more studies, of course. Thank you, Cedar. This is one of our delightful Saybrook students, and she's coming to my aid. Okay, let's have another question.
I guess this gentleman.
Yes, I have a question over here. I was wondering what other methodologies are effective at getting the same results that are non-drug related, like mindfulness meditation or fasting or bubble baths or whatever.
Back up. Okay, let's
So
just do this in
what
parts.
other methodologies are effective at getting the same results as ayahuasca
Okay.
without the drugs?
Okay, what other methodologies have this, what other methodologies are as effective as the ayahuasca without the drugs?
Oh,
Thank you.
there really haven't been any studies, so I'll just have to answer from my own subjective experience. But I personally am a big supporter of meditation in its form, one form or another, especially movement meditations. And you might not get the visions that you get with ayahuasca, but I think you certainly get the insights and the health benefits that you get from ayahuasca. Also, many people will be surprised to hear this, there are many procedures that change the brain for the better. You all know that prayer can change the brain for the better. You know that meditation can change the brain for the better. Good psychotherapy can change the brain for the better. And so there are many disciplines, there are many practices that can bring about brain changes where the brain is more integrated, more effective. Yes, you can change your own brain through some very, very basic disciplines and very, very disciplined practices, including good psychotherapy. Absolutely. So no, you don't need chemicals to change your brain for the better. Absolutely. I can't stress that more clearly.
Thank you.
Here.
One of the things that you talked about in the very beginning was telepathy.
Yes.
And I seem to remember that Andrei Puharich wrote a book talking about telepathy, but I haven't heard anyone say that word for decades. And I wondered if the telepathy comes from the DMT or the MAO inhibitor or from the ayahuasca altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Which one of those?
Yeah, Russ is correct. The active ingredients of the DMT are harmine and harmaline, and this is what was once called telepathine. And so the ingredients would be the DMT part of ayahuasca, as far as we know. Yes. I can tell you a funny story that Russ will appreciate. When I was at Maimonides doing the dream telepathy research and heard about ayahuasca from Allen Ginsberg, I actually got a catalog from a chemical company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I noticed that they were selling harmaline. And I actually ordered some on Maimonides stationery. Could have been fired if they would have known what I was doing. And I got my little bottle of harmaline, and I actually went to a visit with Charles and Judy Tart, and in their presence, they didn't want to partake themselves, but I was willing to give it a try, and I snuffed it. And I had the most gorgeous visions of jungle animals. And that was my taste of the powers of, I didn't have any telepathy, but jungle snakes, panthers, in mosaics. If I were an artist, I could really do that. I could remember that so well. All of my ayahuasca experiences I could paint if I had artistic talent. So that was my introduction. And I was in good hands with Charles and Judy Tart. And so I came through that okay. And then I was really afraid that somebody would notice that I had those bottles in my office. So I gave them to a hippie friend of mine who took them to San Francisco and shared them with his commune. And they had the visions. Oh, yes. Her, and then I want her Beverly. Yes.
Okay, and get closer to you. My daughter and her husband just took ayahuasca last month and just a week ago at a place in Hollister. And they had a sweat lodge the night before, then they had the ayahuasca ceremony, and the day after they had a process called Sapeto, S-A-P-E-T-O. Mm-hmm. This is where they can milk a toad from the Sonoran Desert, and they dry it on a piece of glass, and then you smoke it. And it's supposed to create a 15-minute intense spiritual experience. My daughter had a very intense experience and still having trouble pulling out of some of the dark part, but the positive part looked like his pictures. And she had a wonderful experience from it and depth. However, I'm wondering what you know about the combination of those two, since that's the first time I had heard about it.
First time I've heard too. Thank you for elucidating this. Remember that even in the Amazon, they often add things to the ayahuasca. So whoever arranged this for her was in good company. It's not unusual to add substances, for better or for worse. I think that there are some things that should not be added. But I'm just so happy that she had what she felt was a positive experience. Okay, let's hear from Beverly next.
Thank you, Stan, for a phenomenal talk. My question involves the qualitative research. I'm curious, I'm sure there must be looking at the phenomena of lived experience, and I'm wondering whether there's any map of these spirits that people encounter, the plant beings, etc. What can be said about that?
Did you say map?
Map. A kind of a guideline of what are these spirit beings, the lived experience? Are the encounters so different every time, or is there a common ground to the inner world through ayahuasca?
Is there a guideline mapping out the spirit beings showing up during an ayahuasca experience?
I think that this book has yet to be written. Some of you know who Jim Fadiman is, and he'd make a wonderful speaker for your group. He's at Sophia University. He wrote a great book a few years ago, An Intelligent User's Guide to the Psychedelics. And people that want to take psychedelics, I just refer them to that book, and that would be a good guideline for ayahuasca users as well. I think that eventually there will be such a book, because with LSD, typically you don't throw up, and with ayahuasca, typically you do. And you have to know that throwing up is no disgrace, because ayahuasca is an emetic. It's often called a purgative, and I've never thrown up myself, at least not yet. But when people do throw up, I tell them, just imagine that all the negativity is coming out of your system and look at this positive. So I try to reframe this for them in a very positive way. More than once I've taken people off to the rainforest so that they can throw up and brought them back. I'm used to that, the trip back and forth. It interrupts my own trip, but at least I've been of service to them. And so this has to be built into the guidelines as well. And not enough attention is often given to that purgative effect, because it can be reframed in a very positive way. By the time they throw up, the system has already crossed the blood-brain barrier, so it doesn't interfere with their subsequent experience, of course. One thing I should get back to your question on in terms of alternatives to psychedelics, if people want the beautiful visions, they should remember their dreams more clearly. Because ayahuasca stimulates the visual cortex, so does dreaming. The reason we dream in visual images is the neurochemicals from the lower part of the brain come up and hit the visual cortex, and it's dissociated from the frontal cortex, where a lot of rational thinking goes on. And so our dreams are largely visual and motor in nature. And you can get just as colorful material from your dreams as you can from ayahuasca. So that's another alternative. And I go to China in just a few days and do a whole month of dream work in China. And of course, they've never heard of ayahuasca, and I'm not going to tell them. I don't want to get into that. But yes, we have them do drawings of their dreams and enactments of the dreams, and pay attention to the color and the symbolism and all of that. Okay, go ahead. Who's our next one?
It was about breathing. If you have tried shamanic rapid breathing and the drumming, and similar effects also, but alter consciousness.
So does shamanic breathing, drumming, rapid breathing or drumming give the same effect as the ayahuasca?
Similar.
Similar?
Similar, yes. I would especially draw your attention to holotropic breathing, which is what Stanislaus Grof developed when he could no longer use LSD. I've been in holotropic breathing exercises myself, and I've had very similar experiences to psychedelics. I've actually led holotropic breathing exercises, especially in Brazil. People have very, very intense experiences. It's a discipline. You have to be very deeply and very rapidly to get the effects. And then the group also is important, because once somebody starts to wail or cry or laugh, then other people start to scream or wail or cry or laugh. It's contagious. And so the group setting is very important for the holotropic breathing to have its effect. Yes, and I think that one of my students did a dissertation on holotropic breathing, and there were long-lasting benefits from it, absolutely. So, you mentioned something that I should have included in my list of alternatives, because that's a very effective technique.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, I think we're going to have time for one more question, and then I'll hang out for a little while during the refreshments. Yes?
Can you just give us more about your personal experience with...
Oh, I could talk for the rest of the night about my personal experience.
Positive or negative.
I should mention I had one experience. I should mention that, as some of you know, I'm a longtime student of shamanism, and I have my own particular power animals. And during one of my psychedelic experiences with ayahuasca, I actually was confronted by a jungle snake, probably an anaconda, and I have seen jungle snakes in the Brazilian rainforest, but I've always been protected by a protective screen while I've walked through the jungle. But this one came right up to me and talked with me and said, you know, you have been hanging out with those deer and those birds of paradise and those North American animals and those jaguars with 2 feet like the bird of paradise and the animals with 4 feet. You've ignored the creatures like us that slither on their bellies, and we're your power animals too. You have to adopt the snake as one of your power animals. We can teach you things your other power animals can't. We can teach you to be more graceful. We can teach you how to disguise yourself. We can teach you how to crush your enemies. Oh, I said I need that. And so I got a pretty good lecture from the snake, and so now I've included the snake in my pantheon of power animals, and that came to me in an ayahuasca session. Also, I have not taken ayahuasca for a while because my last session confronted me with a very serious issue I have in my life. And they said, we don't want you to take ayahuasca until this issue is settled. And I'm taking them seriously. And I've had invitations since that time. But yes, I have a very, very serious issue in my life, mammoth issue, and I'm trying to chip away at it and get it under control, and then I can take ayahuasca again. So I get this advice, and I honor the teachings, and so when I get advice, I follow it. I have had let me just give you one more little example, because you folks don't want to hear so much about me.
Yes, we do.
Especially for the last question. But on my, yes, this is a very, very good example. My very, very first full-fledged ayahuasca session was outside of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I was, you've all heard of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I led a group of IONS people to different spiritual centers in Brazil, and they wanted to take ayahuasca, and so I found, with a friend of mine, a very, very good Santo Daime temple in the rainforest outside of Rio de Janeiro, and in this particular temple they separated the men and the women, and they don't always do this, but this time they did. And so here I was sitting on one side of the room, and I was watching what was going on the other side of the room. There was one member of our group who was one of these, what's a nice way to put it, fundamentalist Christians. I have nothing against Christians, but the fundamentalists drive me crazy. And she should never have taken ayahuasca in the first place. And she began to get these images, and she decided this is the work of the devil, and so she was freaking out. And the people in the temple wanted to help her. And the people in our group, the women are, oh, we have to take her outside, she needs air. No, she doesn't need air, she needs expert help. And so there was like this tug of war, these gringos who didn't know what they were doing, trying to take this poor besotted woman out into the air, and the Brazilians who knew exactly what to do, who wanted to take her into the back room where there was a couch and they could minister to her. And I was just watching in panic as this tug of war was going on. I thought, these Americans think they know everything, and when it comes to ayahuasca, they don't know a thing. And they took her outside, she got worse. And so eventually they took her back, and the Brazilians took over. They took her to the back room. They did some aromatherapy with her. They did some chanting, and she was fine within 10 minutes. So that was a very good lesson. Don't think that you know more than your hosts know when it comes to something like ayahuasca, especially in a different country, especially in a different culture. Learn from the people who know the ropes. Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for being here.
Just that realm, as if ayahuasca is a portal to another reality. And is there a level of so-called quasi-objectivity to it that some qualitative research project might unearth?
I'd love to see that done.
I mean, I'm amazed somebody in St. or in Brazil didn't do it, because that should be done, I think.
You know, I'm on the ayahuasca research of this, and there are so many dissertations